In the book, Finding Men for Christ, there's a guy named George Dempster. He's a clergyman way back in the 1920s and 30s in London. And he wrote this book, George Dempster, and he was a pastor. But one day, he disguised himself as a dock worker to unload freighters off the Thames River in London. Now, apparently, in that time and place in London back in the 1920s, the dock workers were often very broken men in need of healing. And so in the low tide, the freighters would dock a little bit away from the shore, and they would use these big, long wooden planks to get out to the boats over the mud flats. And so what they would do is they'd take wheelbarrows of stuff, and they would push it along these wooden planks to get it from the boat to the shore over this like muddy pit. And so George was pushing his wheelbarrow across the plank when some of the dock workers thought it would be funny to take his plank and jiggle it. Which of course caused him to dump his load and fall into the mud. They all roared with laughter from the safety of the shore. The fall was painful. He was dripping wet and knee-deep in mud. Now his instinct was anger. He was hurt on the inside and on the out. But this small voice in his heart told him, this is your opportunity. Don't get mad. This is an opportunity. So he laughed alongside them, and he got up slowly, and one of the dock workers actually jumped into the mud and helped pull him out of the muck. And as they were talking, he had kind of an unusual accent for a dock worker. So George started up a conversation. He said, you tell me your story, and I'll tell you my story. Now, they looked ridiculous. Two men just covered in mud, trying to scrape slime off each other while actually getting more messy in the process. So finally, they get out of the muck, and they decide, we have to go home and change. Like, we can't keep working. We got to go and deal with this. So they go to George's house for coffee. It's not that far, so they walk to his house. And once he was home, the pastor cleaned up and put on his normal pastor clergy outfit, right? And so he comes out to the main room where the dock worker is sitting there having tea, and he kind of stares at him in amazement. And the dock worker says, oh, this is your story? Why were you down on the docks? And George responded, he said, well, to find you. And the dock worker started to get up as if to leave, and the pastor said, no, hang on, a deal's a deal. Thank you for helping me out of the river, for giving me the privilege of meeting you, but you promised to tell me your story. You can see my story. I'm a pastor. What's your story? And there was this long, uncomfortable silence. But the pastor pressed him. He said, look, I just want to know if I can help. And the man shook his head and he said, you can't help me. Well, why not? Because I've gone too far. So Pastor George leaned in and he says, do you think it was an accident that I just happened to get a job alongside you on this particular day in this particular place? Do you think it was by chance that those rascals just happened to choose me for their cruel joke? Do you think it was by coincidence that out of all the crowd, only you jumped down to help me? And so slowly, coaxingly, the pastor got the story out of the guy. The man pulled two pictures out of his pocket. There was a beautiful woman in one picture and two little girls in another picture. And it turns out the dock worker was actually a doctor with a fine record. He had had lots of money, a happy home, lots of friends, but as it so often does, victory defeated him. He became very popular and too busy for church. There was plenty of excuses. And so his social drinking became addicted drinking, and his addicted drinking became necessary drinking. The habit grew stronger and stronger until it completely mastered him. His medical practice, as well as his home and his family, became neglected, unhappiness, and then depression. And then he decided to just disappear. And he abandoned his family. He went to America. And then he went to Canada and back to London, and now he was back, but as a dock worker. He hadn't been home in years. And this is a quote from George Dempster. So the man and he start praying together. And it says, kneeling, this is a quote from the book, kneeling by the table, he and I talked with God. Never can I forget his prayer. At first, the halting, stumbling petition of a broken-hearted, repentant sinner. But as he confessed his feelings in this way, he seemed to become capable of clearer utterance. So as he's going, he's getting better and stronger and more understanding of how to talk to God. And so they get up from the floor. They were kneeling together on the floor. He gets up from the floor. He shakes the pastor's hand. And the broken doctor looks at the pastor and he says, "And you're going to stand by me?" And the pastor says, "Yes." And the doctor said, "Then I will show you what Jesus Christ can do." Now, he started to clean himself up. Now, it had been years. His girls were now finishing up their education, right? It had been a decade or more. And so, but after some time, the man started going back to church, started setting himself back on the path. He was ready to reach out to his family again. His abandoned wife hesitated, unsure. It took a very long time, but over 6 months of clean living, good community support, love, and confession and forgiveness, he eventually came back to his wife, and then to one of the daughters, and then to the other daughter. A home was restored, a family was healed, all because one man fell in the mud. Today, we are continuing our series on the Lord's Prayer. Piece by piece, we have been walking through the most common, ordinary words of the Christian life. Yet when we look closer, we can find impossible, incredible things in the seemingly ordinary. I think many of us repeated the Lord's Prayer so often that we have forgotten how amazing these words are. It's kind of like saying "I love you" to your spouse or to your children. You say it so much, it's almost like a reflex. You stop thinking about what it means. But one of the best things about this sermon series is that for the Lord's Prayer, we get to take a second look. We get to do a double take, look a little closer, rediscover the beauty and the meaning of the Lord's Prayer. Today, we are going to zoom in on the words, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." Today, I want to talk about your trials, temptations, basically the bad things that happen in life and what we're supposed to do with them. So let's dive in. Now, I want to jump into Hebrews chapter 2, verse 17. And it says, Hebrews chapter 2, verse 17. There it is. Therefore, it was necessary for him to, they're talking about Jesus. Therefore, it was necessary for him to be made in every respect like us, his brothers and sisters, so that he could be our merciful and faithful high priest before God. Then he could offer a sacrifice that would take away the sins of the people. Now, they're talking about Jesus, and it said, therefore, he had to become like us, his brothers and sisters. That's you guys. That's me. That's you. And he had to become fully human in every respect so that he could be a merciful and faithful high priest. What they mean is that Jesus was a human being. He dealt with all the things that we deal with. He struggled with the darkness that was around him in life. He was tempted, just like we are tempted. But then it doesn't stop there. In verse 18, it says, since he himself has gone through suffering and testing, he is able to help us when we are being tested. Do you see how it goes? Jesus is not some untouchable person. He has gotten down in the muck with us. Jesus is the part of God that got down in the trenches with us. Jesus pulls us out of the muck by jumping in next to us. Think about the pastor who disguised himself as a dock worker. He could have gotten up in the mud and declared himself I'm a pastor. You have to treat me with respect. He could have, but he didn't. And he saved a family because of it, by getting his hands dirty, right? And so what I want you to realize this morning is that there is community to be found in resisting temptation. We are in this together. Jesus suffered. He dealt with temptation, and he overcame that temptation. When I say he was tempted, I do not mean he sinned. He never sinned. He showed us that it can be done. You can live that life and say no to sin. And so he can invite us to do the same. He walks with us through all our bad times. And so what I realized is that suffering is something we're supposed to do together, supporting one another. And yet for some reason, most of us have this mental block. We tell ourselves, don't tell anyone that I'm struggling. Don't let it show that there's darkness in my life. We're like Elsa in that Disney movie Frozen. You guys remember that movie, right? Where she's like, conceal, don't feel, don't let anyone know I'm struggling. So many people struggle with the exact same things, but we let shame and embarrassment control our hearts, and so then we isolate ourselves from the love of our neighbors, right? One of the privileges of being a pastor is that I get to know people's stories. As I have been a pastor, I hear people's stories, I know what people are going through, and maybe we don't tell each other what you're struggling with, but I get to hear a lot of the stories. People will come talk to me, and that is such an honor. Like, I love that about my job. I love that about being a pastor. Now, I would never break confidentiality, right? There's an expectation. You come talk to the pastor, I'm not going to go talk about it to other people. Of course. But there are moments, especially like right now, in the middle of worship, where I look out and I know what this person's struggling with and what this person's struggling with, and both of them think they're the only person in the world who is struggling with that. And they're right next to each other. And so I'm not going to break confidentiality, but I just want you to understand, you are not the only person who is going through the things you are struggling with. We are, whatever you are struggling, I promise there are people who are dealing with the same thing. I had a man come to me and he said, yeah, but Pastor, I have a drug addiction problem. And I told him he was new to the church, and I knew he didn't know anybody's name. And I said, well, there's a guy who sits 3 pews behind you, has the exact same problem. There's a guy who sits in the choir loft. He also has the same problem. And I told him that because then I went and told those people. And I said, hey, he needs some guidance. He needs some help. He told me I could do that, right? He gave me permission. And we surrounded him with love, and he's sober and clean in that community because there were people all around him he just didn't even know. He just didn't even know. Now, when you privatize your struggles, you suck the purpose out of them. Now, I'm not saying that we should complain more. That's not my point here. I'm not saying we should go and complain about, but Jesus took his suffering and he put it to work. Jesus took his pain and he made use of it. It says, since he himself has gone through the suffering and the testing, he is able to help us who are being tested. The greatest mistake we can make when bad things happen is to think that it is only all about you. But if you follow the example of Jesus, if you put your suffering to work, you can actually use it to help the people around you. I've been through this horrible thing. I bet I can help other people use that. And maybe you've heard that some of the greatest drug counselors are former addicts. Some of the greatest marriage counselors are those who have struggled in their own relationships. Some of the greatest financial advisors are those who have made great big mistakes in their life. Most of us have learned from our trials and our struggles. I'm not saying you have to struggle in order to help someone, but I'm saying your struggles help you help someone. We can learn from what we go through. Jesus had to become like his brothers and sisters in every way so that he could turn around and help those who are being tested. When I think about testing and trials and temptations and struggles, my mind is drawn to Zechariah chapter 13. Let me read it for you. Zechariah chapter 13, verse 8 and 9, it says, it's hard to explain. 2/3 of the people in the land will be cut off and die, says the Lord. But the 1/3 will be left in the land. And I will bring that group of people through the fire and make them pure. I will refine them like silver. I will purify them like gold. They will call on my name and I will answer them. I will say, these are my people. And they will say, the Lord is our God. Now, I don't have time to get too much into the context, but basically, the nation of Israel was going through some really hard times. They were going through some really big struggles. And they'd lost their home and their families. They lost all their stuff, their entire identity. And he lays it out there. It's kind of brutal. He's like, look, 2/3 of you aren't going to make it through this trial. And the 1/3 that makes it, I'm going to stick you in the fire. Right? He says that right off the bat. He says, I'm going to put him through the ringer. I will refine my people. Are you guys familiar with this metaphor of refining metals? If you've never heard it, it's pretty common. When you pull precious metals out of the ground, right, like gold or silver or whatever, when you pull it out, it's full of impurities, right? And so what you have to do is you stick it in the fire, and you have to melt it down, and then all the impurities rise to the surface, and they burn off, right? And then you take the pure metal, and you pour it into the little mold for jewelry or bars or whatever you're making, right? But that's how you do it. That's what God does with us. Here's the thing. The Bible's very clear. Problems will come. The fire will come. Bad things happen in our lives. To quote the Princess Bride, life is pain, Your Highness. Anybody who tells you differently is selling something. That's a fun movie. Bad things happen in all of our lives. There's no choice there, but it is our response in those moments. That is a choice. There's always going to be bad things, but how we respond is a choice. I can't keep bad things from happening to you in your life. Some pastors promise that. They're like, if you follow God, nothing bad will ever happen to you again. It's just not true. I can't promise you that. Bad things are going to happen to you. But the way we respond, that is in our control. When you face a problem, whatever it might be, medical problem, depression, betrayal, struggles in your marriage, family, work, I like to use general words like darkness, because it kind of applies to everything at every level. But when you face a problem, right, and you just focus in on yourself, if you make it all about yourself, you will suck the purpose out of your pain. But Jesus gives us a better way. By focusing on the people around you, you turn your oppression into an opportunity. Ask yourself, okay, this horrible thing I'm going through, how am I going to be able to better love people because of it? Like, what am I learning from this terrible thing that I am going through? You've fallen in the mud. Are you going to get angry? Or are you going to listen to that small voice that whispers to you, this terrible thing is an opportunity? God uses difficult situations to strengthen our faith. The devil's going to try and use it to weaken and destroy your faith, but God will use it to strengthen your faith. Here's an example. A couple weeks ago, we had a little baby girl. And I don't know how many of you guys know this, but all babies, when they're born, they lose weight. First time they poop, they get lighter, And so they get a lot lighter, and then they have to gain that weight back. But our little girl didn't gain her weight back. She lost a lot of weight, like a scary amount of weight. She was 8 pounds, 6 ounces, and she almost lost 2 pounds. And the midwife was concerned, and the nutritionist was concerned, and mom and dad were terrified. And they said, you have to start feeding her every hour, like 24 hours a day. Every hour you have to wake her up, and you have to get food into her because she's losing weight. It was terrifying. Same thing happened with Asher. It was awful. I hate those moments. We had like 2.5 days of every single hour. There was no sleep for those days. It was awful, and I never want to go through that again. But you know what? I know how to handle that now. I've been through this terrible thing, and I know how to comfort someone who is going through that. So if there was someone who was struggling with my baby, and I'm panicked and I'm freaking out, and no one else is going through this, I get to step up. I get to say, I do know what you're going through. I've been through that. It was awful. I'm right there with you. Let me pray for you. Do you see how this terrible thing that happened, because I hated it. I don't ever want to say that was a good thing, but I can use it. It's an opportunity for me to learn, for me to better love. Because of our suffering, Sarah and I are now a resource to anyone else who might be going through something similar. We know what it feels like, and we know all that anxiety and the lack of sleep. And I do want to mention, she's doing great now. She's gaining all kinds of weight, and she's getting those chubby rolls that you want all babies to have. So she's been gaining weight for about 2 weeks now. She's doing great. But it was scary that first week. And so we have an opportunity to help others, to love others who could go through the same thing. There's always going to be bad stuff in life. Bad things happen. The question for you is, what are you going to do with that bad stuff? Will you follow the example of Jesus and use your pain to help others? Will you let God use the difficult situations you've been through in his plan of redemption? Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. These are the only words in the Lord's Prayer that are spoken from a place of darkness. When a time of trial comes in our lives, our cry to God is, don't let it overwhelm me. Don't let me give up. Don't let me give in. Help me find the opportunity in the pain. The good news this morning is that God delivers us from evil. The good news, there's two parts to that. The first part is that there is evil. You can call it whatever you want. Temptation, struggle, oppression, obstacles, darkness. Stuff happens. There's always going to be evil. And actually, the more you walk with God and the more you try to stand up and be a moral and righteous man of God or woman of God, the more you do that, the worse it gets. The stronger the temptations are in your life. God delivers us from evil because there is evil in our life. But the second part of the phrase is I want you to pay attention to the verb. It says, God delivers us from evil. God is the one doing the action. Is he carries us out of the darkness. It doesn't say God gives you superpowers, or God cheerleads, or God helps. It says God delivers, right? God does all the work. All we need to do is cling to him and his teachings. You are not the driver. You are the passenger. Just make sure you're in the right car. So, sometimes when we are facing problems in life, we can feel so helpless. We feel like there's nothing we can do. But in that moment, I want you to remember that God is the one who delivers you. I mean, do you see how liberating that is? Right? If you're ever feeling forced, like there's nothing I can do and I'm stuck and I just can't, then you're not living into the freedom that God gives you. You have forgotten your identity as a child of God. Excuse me. I heard this phrase in a Bible study a while back. It said, we do not fight for victory. We fight from victory. You have already won the battle with sin. Do you know how I know? Because you're not the one fighting. If it was me versus my sin, do you know who wins? It's not me. I have lost every time I've tried to do it on my own. But when it's this guy, when it's Jesus fighting for me, we can overcome. We are not a slave. Jesus frees us from the slavery of sin and death. Excuse me. He shows us that it is possible to take suffering and turn it into a refining fire. With Jesus, you do not have to obey the brokenness of the world. You are not a slave. All right, now I want to make this really practical. If God is going to deliver us, if we are going to walk in the deliverance of the Lord, here are some concrete steps that you can take. Back in Hebrews chapter 2, where we started, back in verse 1 of chapter 2, it says, now, excuse me, now we must listen very carefully to the truth that we have heard, or we may drift away from it. You have to listen carefully to the truth, otherwise we will drift. In your life, you are prone to drift away from truth. It takes almost no energy in your life to drift away from God. A lot of people, it happened during COVID, right? It just, I can't go to church because it's shut down, and we just drift away from God, right? Now think about when you're driving on the road. If you're going on a straight road and the wheels are straight and you're all lined up, can you take your hands and put them in your pocket? How long would that work? About 10 feet, right? And then the car would just because it drifts, right? When you're driving, you need little corrections. That's how you stay on the path. It's the same in our lives. Think about a canoe on a river. If you stop paddling, if you're trying to go this way or that way, and you stop paddling, what's going to happen? Are you going to stop moving? Nope, you're going to keep getting carried right along by the river. We drift. You'll float along with the tide. We tend to drift into temptation. And so the first step, the first thing you need to do if you want to walk in deliverance is to pinpoint your weakness. Ask yourself, when am I weak? Where am I weak? What are my weaknesses? Matthew 26, Jesus is talking to the disciples, and he says, keep watch and pray so that you will not give in to temptation, for the spirit is willing, but the body is weak. You've heard that, right? Other translations will say the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. Like I want to do the right thing, but my body is weak. So I want to ask yourself, when are you the weakest? When is your willpower at the lowest level in your life? right? Some people say my flesh is the weakest when I am hungry, right? My flesh is weakest when I am tired or when I'm lonely or when I'm scared, or maybe it's when I'm feeling invincible. That's when I am the weakest, the most tempted. You see, temptation is sneaky. Temptation doesn't come into our lives all big and bold, right? It sneaks in. It creeps in 1,000 different ways. For example, the Great Wall of China is one of the greatest feats of human engineering in history, right? You can see it from outer space, this wall. And they built this incredible wall to keep the enemy out, and it worked for a while. Do you know how the enemy got through the first time they breached the Great Wall of China? They didn't go over the wall. The wall was too strong. They bribed the gatekeeper. Right? Temptation doesn't do a full frontal assault on your life. Some of us think like, I can handle temptation. If it comes, I'm ready for it. But it doesn't come at us straight on. It sneaks in. It drifts into our lives. Temptation starts small. It drifts into our lives. So we got to be vigilant. There's a reason you don't go grocery store shopping when you're hungry, right? Right? Don't go to the grocery store when you're hungry, because why? You go buy so much junk you didn't even need, right? Oh, I need 10 of these. Oh, man, I'm so hungry. I need 3 of those. And no, you eat a nice big meal, then you go grocery shopping, right? So then you buy the stuff you need. It's the same principle. Pinpoint your weakness. Look at your life and know when you are weak. So that's the starting point. The second step is plan your way out. We know that temptations are going to come. We know that. So plan it out in advance. If you're sober, you don't make the decision to drink alcohol when somebody hands you a cup. You made that decision long ago. You know what your answer is before they ask, right? You don't make the decision to gossip or shame someone in the moment you hear a juicy story. You made that decision before about what kind of person you want to be. Know who you want to be. Know how you want to act before you get into those situations. Know what you're going to say before you are offered. 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 22, it says, Timothy 2, chapter 2, verse 22, it says, run from anything that stimulates youthful lust. Instead, pursue righteous living, faithfulness, love, and peace. Enjoy the companionship of those who call on the Lord with pure hearts. The way you run away is to know what you're going to say before you even get into the situation. So pinpoint your weakness, know when you're vulnerable, and then make a plan. Now, the last piece to fighting temptation, once you've planned your way out, is to set up a safety net. Sometimes, even when we've made the right decision ahead of time and we know when we are weak, sometimes still our willpower is not enough. So you have to set up a safety net. Most of the time, that can come from the people around you in life. Like we saw at the beginning, suffering is not something we're supposed to do alone. Sometimes you need an accountability buddy, someone who knows what you are struggling with and is praying for you and will ask you about it. Think about it like a personal trainer, right? Maybe you want to lose some weight, and so you meet with a personal trainer, and they give you an outline. They're like, all right, you got to do these exercises, and you got to eat this much, and then I'm going to talk to you tomorrow and see how you did. Now, maybe you want to go home and throw away their meal plan and eat a whole bag of chips, right? That's what I want to do when I'm like, look at this meal plan. Yeah, all right, whatever. But if I know he's going to ask me the next day, yeah, I'm stuck, right? I can't get away with it. I can't do the thing I want to do because I know they're going to ask me. Excuse me, I'm so sorry. You make different decisions when the safety net is in place, when you are accountable to someone. So if I set a goal, this can be avoiding things, but also adding things to your life. If I set a goal that I want to read my Bible and I want to pray with God for 15 minutes every morning, and I tell my friend Cherie about that goal, and I say, okay, Cherie, will you ask me about that every day? Will you text me and say, hey, how was your time with God this morning? If I know that text message is coming, I'm going to act differently, right? I'm going to change my behavior. If that safety net is in place, your odds of success skyrocket, right? I had a friend who was drifting away from the church one time. She was part of a life group, and they met every single week. They met at this life group, and she was drifting away from church, and she hadn't been in a couple weeks, and so the leader of the life group reached out to her, and she said, hey, how you doing? I haven't seen you in a couple of weeks, and my friend was so offended. She comes to me and she's like, oh my gosh, I'm never going back there. They're so invasive. They're all up in my business. And I was baffled. I looked at her, I was like, I mean, praise God. I'm so glad you have a church that cares about you, that noticed when you're gone and is reaching out to you. Isn't that amazing? Sounds like your church is awesome. She didn't like hearing that, but pinpoint your weakness, make a plan, and set up your safety net. These are concrete, practical ways that you can walk in the deliverance that God gives you from temptation. Really, my whole application for this whole sermon is just, I want you to pray that line, lead us not into temptation and deliver us from evil. I want you to pray that, but I want you to remember what you're saying, right? Think about what you just asked God to do. When we come before God and we say, lead me not into temptation, we are asking God in that moment when something bad happens, we're saying, God, I'm just begging you to use my pain for good. If this is what life has to bring, then let it have purpose. Let it have meaning. Take my brokenness, use it for good. I have fallen in the mud. Lead me not into the temptation of giving up, into the temptation of wallowing or self-pity. Take my pain, my brokenness, my suffering, and help other people with it. Redeem it for your glory. We stand before God, watching the example of Jesus, and we say, sometimes I have to suffer like Jesus suffered, and I'm okay with that if you're going to use it for your glory, if you're going to use it to heal someone else. I think about George Dempster falling in the mud. I mean, that moment was an opportunity, and he turned that suffering into salvation. So pinpoint your weakness, make a plan, and set up your safety net, and God will deliver you from temptation. Let's pray.